In this video, we're going to take a look at how we go from the Articles of Confederation, which is a weak first national government, to a strong central government in the Constitution. So after the American Revolution, the 13 colonies become 13 independent states. Each state will have its own government, headed by a governor, and they will have their own constitution. Under the first articles, there were a lot of weaknesses that occurred. While Congress was able to create an army and declare war, it did not have the power to tax or to raise tariffs, which is taxes on trade. That means that they couldn't pay any debts that they owed during the American Revolution because they couldn't tax or have tariffs. So this is very weak. What they did try to do in the states, though, is raise taxes on the average person. So each state would raise their taxes on the average person, and if you could pay it, you were good, and if you couldn't, many people ended up losing their property and being put in debtor's prison. So this was one of the reasons why the Articles of Confederation, this weak association between the states, did not work. So in this photo, we see just a visual representation of a rebellion in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion. And here we see the gentleman on top is representative of the farmers, and the gentleman on the bottom is representative of the state government collecting taxes. So some of the causes of Shays' Rebellion: a lot of the farmers had poor harvests, and because they did not have a lot of money, they could not pay the taxes that they had to be paying to pay for the American Revolution debt. And then many lost their farms or were put into prison as debtors. So after this rebellion, it showed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, and this led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia, where the Founding Fathers would write the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. This would create a strong central government that all of the states had to listen to. So if we look at the Constitutional Convention, we have representatives from most of the states discussing how to fix some of these problems, including issues with trade, taxes, debt, rebellions, right? We didn't have an army to stop Shays' Rebellion because we couldn't pay for it. So the main goal of the Constitutional Convention is to decide how citizens of each state would be representative in this new national or federal government. And the reason it's important is because the federal or the central government creates laws that affect the lives of all Americans. So if our federal government creates laws, every citizen in every state must follow that law. So we had some states like New Jersey that had a small population, and we had places like Virginia that had a large population. The question was, how would they compromise? New Jersey and the smaller states came up with an idea where every state would have equal representation in Congress. So whether you have 10 people or 10 million people in your state would be equal. Virginia said it should be based on population. So the Founding Fathers, after days and weeks of arguing, come up with an agreement where they would create something called a bicameral legislature. Bi meaning two. So in our Congress or our legislature today, we have two houses of lawmakers. So in Congress, you see on the left side, we have the House of Representatives, and each state gets the number based on population. So if you have more people in your state, you get more representatives in the House. And in the Senate, it's every state will get 2 senators. They keep it equal, and that's to kind of keep happy the small states. So again, how do the representatives get there? They get that job by getting voted in by the citizens. And again, it's very important because in Congress they make laws that all states and Americans must follow. Another disagreement was between southern states, which were slave states, where they allowed slavery to happen, and northern states, which were free states, where slavery was illegal. So the South wanted to count their slaves for population, and the North did not. Again, if you get more representatives from your state, you have stronger powers in writing laws. So the South kind of really feared losing slavery. So the compromise is called the 3/5 compromise. Out of every 5 slaves, 3 would count towards population. That meant that the South would get a little bit more representatives in the House of Representatives because they would use slaves as population. And the goal is to create the U.S. Constitution, which shows that we have a strong central government where we represent all of the states and all of the people and protect the rights of everyone. So let's zoom in real quick and take a look at what the Constitution shows us. The first part is called the preamble. Pre means before, and amble comes from the Latin word to walk. So before you walk through the Constitution, what's the intro? And the introduction to this Constitution tells us what the purpose of government is. Then we have a group of sections called articles, and the first 3 are very important. The first article is about the legislative branch, or Congress. It's about all of the rules and regulations that Congress has and the powers that they can use in running the government. Article 2 is about the executive branch. When you think of this, you want to think of the president. It's the powers of the president and those who advise him or her. And the third article would be the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, how they will operate and run to run the legal system of the whole United States. One of the things the framers thought about was some of the Enlightenment thinking, like with Montesquieu, which was have the checks and balances. And instead of having a king or a queen, you would separate those powers into 3 different branches. And they would have power over each other to make sure that one does not have more power than the rest. So we see the president is in the executive branch, Congress making laws in the legislative, and the Supreme Court's in the judicial branch. One of the powers the executive branch has is the veto, which means they can say no or cancel a law. So if Congress writes a law and tries to send it to the president for him or her to sign, the president can say no. Congress can get the law back from the president and override it with a 2/3 majority. This has only happened a few times and has not happened recently, but it is a check and a balance. Again, the legislative branch is bicameral, 2 houses. The Supreme Court can look at laws and actions taken by Congress and determine whether they are constitutional or unconstitutional. That is called judicial review. They review whether a law is legal or illegal. On the other hand, checking that power is Congress can remove or impeach members of the Supreme Court if they act in a way that is against the rules of government. We currently have 9 members of the Supreme Court. We keep it an uneven number so there could be no ties. The president gets to appoint members to the Supreme Court if a vacancy or opening occurs. But Congress must approve the president's nomination, so there's yet another check and another balance. To ensure that states do not lose too much of their power over their people, the government created something called federalism. It's when they share powers between the national, think of the president, and state governments, think of the governor. Powers that we give the national or the federal government are called delegated. Powers that go to the state, we reserve for them. And powers that they both share are called concurrent, con meaning together. Sometimes the regents will talk about enumerated powers. That just means listed powers for the federal government. Certain things that only the federal government can do, thinking of the president and Congress, is go to war, create money, and have treaties with other nations. States can create their school systems and the rules for driving and having driver's license. Something they both do that not many people really like to do is to pay their taxes. So states can also tax as well as the federal government. And this is called federalism, to share that power. Another part of the Constitution, sometimes called the necessary and proper clause, is also called the elastic clause. Elastic stretches. So the founding fathers knew that society would evolve and change, and that Congress and the government should be able to change with it. So they should be able to make rules and laws that change with society. So for example, there used to be muskets back in the 1700s, which are very low quality guns, and now there are machine guns. We have about 4 million people back when the Constitution was written. There's 400, so the Constitution needs to change with a changing society. And for example, there's sometimes parts of the Constitution called the unwritten Constitution. These are powers that the government has that is not directly written into the Constitution. So, some examples of this are political parties. Currently, we have Republicans and Democrats as the major party, but there's many others. That's not in the Constitution, but it's something the government has interpreted as being necessary to carry out the duties. Also, something called the presidential cabinet. The cabinet are advisors to the president that help him or her with different areas of expertise to run the government. Not all of the founding fathers or representatives agreed on how the government should run. A group called the Federalists were in favor of a strong central government. Anti-Federalists were not, and were afraid of a strong tyranny. They wanted a Bill of Rights to protect citizens. So they had to compromise or agree on this Constitution in order to ratify or pass this Constitution by the states. So what did the Federalists want? Well, they did want the Constitution, and they wanted a strong federal or central government. And they used a group of documents called the Federalist Papers to argue why this was needed. Some of the arguments were they needed to pay war debt, so they needed a strong government to help tax and regulate that. They wanted to create a strong government for protection, and they wanted to create checks and balances to prevent tyranny. They didn't think that a Bill of Rights was necessary. The Anti-Federalists wanted stronger states' rights and states' power. Many of them wanted to protect farmers' interests over industrial interests, as well as slave owners. So they also wanted a Bill of Rights. So we get our Bill of Rights from the Anti-Federalists. These are protections for citizens such as freedom of speech, press, and assembly. This is not part of the Constitution. It's in addition to the Constitution. These are amendments or changes. So these are very important, and this is one of the number one reasons why many people want to live in the United States. Here we're just going to quickly look at the Bill of Rights. We will study this more in depth in a later unit. Right, our First Amendment, freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly. Second Amendment, freedom to bear arms. Okay, third, no quartering soldiers. Fourth, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. Okay, fifth, rights of the accused. You should know why you're being arrested and face your accusers. And the other next couple are the same. Amendment 8, no cruel, unusual punishment or excessive bail. So those protect our rights. The last part that goes with this unit is a Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And all this really is just a way for the government to have rules to admit new states. One of the biggest rules is that you have to have at least 60,000 people living in a territory in order for you to apply to statehood, and you'd have to be voted in for that. And here we see our first national, federal, or central government, and our first president, number 1, George Washington. That's why he's on our dollar bill. And he set a couple of precedents, such as having two terms, which was 8 years. And a precedent is an example set by somebody.